Hello and welcome back to Highway to Hoover, a production of SEC Extra over at d1baseball.com. I'm your host, Joe Healy, joined as always by my good friend and co-host, Mark Etheridge. We are back after an accidental week hiatus. That's about the best way to describe it. I mentioned on the last episode that Mark and I reserved the right to take a week off here or there. I didn't anticipate it would be literally the next week, but hey, we're here. I was on Cape Cod last week. I didn't really think about how that would affect the podcasting schedule. And I know as I say that, I was on Cape Cod. Like life is hard, Mark. I don't know what to tell you.
Poor Joe.
Yeah, everybody's going to feel sorry for me. But it made it to where our schedules just didn't quite align for something. So we punted on it, but we are back today. We are going to talk about overlooked storylines in the SEC East. We'll do the East this week. We'll do the West next week. This will also be kind of serving as a goodbye to divisions, Mark, as it turns out, because we're done with that after this past season. So yeah. So this will be the last time we'll have that crutch to split this up into two divisions. But so East this week, West next week. The goal here is, we talk, every week on this podcast about all these teams. So we cover a lot of ground. Most things we've talked about in depth, but there might be some things that for whatever reason just we didn't cover. They didn't get covered generally. And so the idea here is that we want to talk about some of those, maybe some things that even if it's your team, that you didn't necessarily think of. So we'll go through that today. We'll start with the East. We're going to do it in standings order. I don't know why I couldn't think of that word. Standings order. So we're going from Tennessee to Mizzou in the East first. Before we get going, Mark, I filibustered there at the beginning. I guess I should check in. The listeners want to know how are you, Mark? How are things going? How was your summer?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of struggling to know what to do with my time now that I'm not writing about baseball and watching games. I mean, it's definitely a transition. Watched the All-Star game and saw a familiar face Tuesday night with Paul Skeens doing Paul Skeens things in his one inning. That for me is just amazing, the journey that he's taken. A couple years ago he was at Air Force and a two-way player and a good one, but nothing displayed what was coming. And man, he goes to LSU, lights the world on fire, gets drafted first overall, learns a splinker during the off season and gets a lot better, and when you're already that good and you go in with that growth mindset, it just goes to show you, and you have that ability, obviously, goes to show you what you can accomplish. Just a fantastic story. And I'm just, I was, it's almost like, someone, right? And you're pulling for them to succeed because you have that connection. So it's been really cool to watch.
Yeah, really amazing. I mean, baseball people who I trust, because I think you and I are in the same boat. We're just not following MLB as closely as we are the college game, but MLB people that I trust, are saying things like the type of stuff that he's doing is like pretty unprecedented. In terms of, setting all these different marks for, like, he's the first pitcher to do this and his first X number of starts since Y or Z, that kind of stuff. Seems like every time out, he's got one more like that. And it's crazy to me. I put this in one of our D1 baseball internal chats today, that it's amazing that he started the All-Star game and did what he did on Tuesday. And like 14 months ago, guys like Dominic Temez were trying to get it. No disrespect to Dominic Temez, he's a good player, but your average SEC player was trying to get a hit off Paul Skeens, and like now the best hitters in the world can't get hits really off Paul Skeens. So just a crazy rise from to your point, after his years at Air Force, where he was a very good pitcher, and I saw him with Team USA. When he pitched for them, and it was good, I was impressed, but he wasn't necessarily the best guy out there, it just goes to show how quickly he improved and what he's done since then. And so yeah, definitely a cool story, and I think a cool college baseball story, because there's a lot of sliding doors moments, and in a world, heck, for that matter, in a world without the portal, for all the complaining that people do about the portal, and I get it, without the portal, we don't get that story. He ends up at Air Force and probably does 4 years at Air Force because that's kind of the way you typically do things there. And then maybe he goes to pro ball, but maybe he decides, I'm just going to do the pilot thing. I don't know. So like, it is kind of a neat deal that we got to experience that. And now he's obviously on his way to what looks like an incredible major league career. So
yeah, a lot of things had to line up for that to happen. Absolutely.
Yeah, no doubt. Among the big notable items, we apparently got a drunk national anthem at the home run derby. There was that.
Yeah.
That's I mean, the singer is as she said herself, checking into rehab. So I don't want to make light too much of that situation, but man, that was, I was relieved there was maybe an explanation, because otherwise it was like, how did they make this mistake?
Yeah, somebody needed to step in prior to her taking the microphone.
Yeah.
But alas,
did not.
Wasn't to be.
Yeah. All right, let's talk SEC East overlooked storylines, Mark. And the first team we're going to talk about is probably the hardest, and that's Tennessee. And that's just because we spent so long watching Tennessee this season that overlooked is hard to come by on this team. Yeah. I'll hit lead off on this one, and I think that for me, it was the emergence of Aaron Combs as like another guy in the bullpen, because this team could have won the national title without him. Like, I'm not saying he was the key piece, but he made their bullpen so much better when he kind of became what he was down the stretch. Because it took him a little while to get there. He was not from opening day on just like this real dude in the bullpen, but he got there. And he pitched a lot of important innings late in the season. And so when you look at their bullpen, the way they set it up, where you knew you were going to get Snead, you knew you were going to get Connell, and then you knew you were going to get Combs. And those were really the guys they trusted. And if I'm missing one, it's slipping off the top of my head here. But like, those were kind of their guys. And so Combs gave them depth they just didn't have early in the season. And so, again, they were talented enough to do it without him. But, man, he made their path so much easier by giving him that added piece of depth in the bullpen.
Yeah, and their pitching was such an interesting piece, because they've had all of these years where it was just flamethrower, and this year they had some of that, but it was such a versatile pitching staff, and they won in various ways, a lot of different looks, a lot of arm slots, all of these different things, and that kind of segues wonderfully to my choice here, and that's Cal Stark. I mean, he did a masterful job catching that staff that, as we mentioned, had a lot of different looks, a lot of guys with a lot of run on the ball. And he only hit 212. And he was a guy before the season started where they tried to replace him, right? They brought in Cannon Peebles. I mean, Dalton Bargo's, had some catching experience. Charlie Taylor was on the roster. I mean, it would have been very easy for him to lose his focus and go, okay, well, they don't really want me here, and to go into a shell. But instead, he was one of the leaders on that team. And for all of the talk about the great offense and how good they were, and he wasn't an automatic out, but he was certainly the 9-hole hitter for a reason. It just, it kind of showed that you don't have to be the superstar to play a vital role on a team. If you're the guy who leads it, who handles the staff well, who's a good leader in the dugout, leader on the field, you can have impacts that I guess overcome a lack of statistical output, and I think that's what we saw with him.
It's a good call. My other one that I had kind of in the holster, we'll just skip by it quickly, is that Dylan Loy kind of ended up being their best freshman arm. And, I went into the year thinking it might be Derek Schaefer. It might be Matthew Dallas. Right. Now, both those guys have transferred out. Dallas is going to Wake Forest, I believe. And Derek Schaefer, maybe Arizona State. I know he's from Arizona, but regardless, those two guys are gone. Like, Dylan Loy is still there. I mean, he's an athletic kid who they like the potential of, but he ended up being the one guy who kind of stood out as, if we're going to give a freshman some innings here, it's going to be Dylan Loy. And now he's He was on the roster for the collegiate national team training camp. Like, he's a guy who's probably going to go into next year as somebody they look at as a potential starter. So that's going to be interesting to see.
Right.
Let's talk Kentucky, Mark. You go ahead and go first on this one. Another team that we talked plenty about, just given the run they made and the story that they were last year. So maybe tough to come by some overlooked stuff here, but go ahead and give it a shot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, it's Trey Poozer being the Friday guy. I mean, because heading into the fall, I mean, he was just one of the guys on the list, and even heading into the spring, we certainly didn't have him pegged as a weekend guy, much less the Friday night starter. And for him to go in and end up being one of the best Friday guys in the entire league. I mean, hell, he went 7-1 for the SEC champion, who goes on to our co-champs, goes on to Omaha, and he plays a big part in that. I mean, just amazing. I mean, and he wasn't a guy or he's still not a guy who's going to blow it by you, right? He's not a super velocity guy. He just understands how to pitch, and he goes, you don't have to be, Paul Skeens that we talked about. You can get outs other ways, and he was just a great example of that.
It's a good call. I mean, he was, we've talked about this before, kind of an accidental Friday guy, but then grew into that role where by the end of it, I mean, he, in terms of stuff, he wasn't, you wouldn't have looked at him and said, that's a Friday night guy. But you look at how consistent he was week after week after week, and it felt like he almost got better as the season went on. Yeah. He was, by the end, he was a legitimate Friday guy. Yeah. Not just like a pretty good considering the circumstances kind of guy. Sometimes you get like, I think that was my expectation early on for him, was like, you know what, he's doing a nice job when you consider that he's not a traditional Friday guy. Right. But as the season went on, it was like, no, actually this guy's just really good.
Right.
I'm going to go with Nolan McCarthy, he was really good for them all around. And he didn't lead them in hitting. He didn't lead them in home runs. He didn't swipe a whole ton of bases, but he did a lot of things really well. He had some pop. He put the bat on the ball. He could run a little bit. He played a great outfield. Made a number of really important catches as the year went on. And he'll be interesting to watch in the offseason. He's in the portal. I think there was an assumption early on made that he was going to follow Nick Amarati from Kentucky to Georgia, assistant coach going from Kentucky to Georgia. That has not happened as of yet. Perhaps he was waiting to see if maybe there would be draft interest, just to kind of see what happens there. And maybe that changes. So we'll see where he ends up, but regardless, even if he does end up leaving Kentucky, I think if you're a Kentucky fan, you might be disappointed in that, but I think at the same time, you can appreciate what he brought to the table in 2024, because he was quietly a really, really important piece of the puzzle there for the Wildcats.
Yeah, something you said really kind of spurred, maybe this is an aside, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. If you're in the portal and you haven't found anyone and the draft is nearing, I think you should wait. Because wait and see what the draft does, because not only could you get more scholarship, you could get more NIL, you could get more playing time based on any kinds of surprises that the draft gives you. A guy goes higher than they expected, or maybe somebody goes lower than you expected, and you really wanted to go to that school, and now you're going to have to compete for a spot where before it looked like you weren't. I think that's some leverage that, I didn't really. I was kind of surprised at how quickly some of these guys who went into the portal found a new home with the draft looming. I mean, that's the big domino out there. So, just you mentioned that with McCarthy, and that's something I think it would be smart if I'm in that spot. You don't want to get boxed out and run out of roster spots. But on the other hand, if you're one of these guys who can afford to wait, why wouldn't you, and try to maximize what your opportunities are?
I think it's a great point. Yeah, I mean, if you're, you might as well get more information. And look, if you're a fringy guy, maybe there's some risk there because okay, there's only so many teams that are going to be interested.
But I mean,
if you're Right. If you're Nolan McCarthy, like, you're going to have options. So there's not a ton of downside risk there, because at a bare minimum, I don't know, this is not inside information, but at a bare minimum, I'm sure Kentucky would love to have him back, right? If he says, look, I thought I might want to do this, but whatever it is. It's a great call. All right, let's talk Georgia. Yeah. So for me, this is kind of a big picture one, and that's that I think more so than any team in the league, the pitching statistics don't totally capture that they were pretty good down the stretch. Whether it's on an individual level, I mean, we've talked a lot about Colton Smith. I mean, he's obviously the most outlier of the examples, but even Christian Mrachna, who signed a free agent deal today with Toronto, I believe. His numbers weren't good, but by the end of the year, like, he was one of their trusted guys, right? And so I'm not trying to say he was Evan Aschenbeck in terms of his performance there, or how trustworthy he was, but that was a pitching staff that at times during the season looked kind of adrift and lost and not really sure, what they had. And it ended up being a pitching staff that was, got them to within a win of getting to Omaha ultimately. And so, it had some young pieces, and, you come back another year with those guys, Wes Johnson, working with them for another year. I think that the future is bright for Georgia from a pitching perspective, even if you look at this past season and on paper, it doesn't look like it went all that well.
Yeah, they definitely overachieved. I mean, just looking at you look at their stats, you look at the collection of the parts. They should not have been a super regional team within one game of the College World Series, but they were, man. And a lot of that was obviously attributed to the offense, but the pitching, they won some games for them. So it's a proof of concept. If you're a Georgia fan, you got to be feeling really hopeful. For me, and it kind of goes along with, you're setting me up again, is Burton. As a guy who is, look at his numbers, 3-3 with a 5.66 ERA, 6 saves. All right, he was just okay, right? You realize he had 10 appearances where he went 3+ innings. Closers don't do that, and they would just ride him, right? And his numbers would be better if he could come in, and pick his spots and go shorter stints. But because of what we talked about, they were trying to find the right mix and match, and maybe weren't comfortable with some guys at points in the season. He really had to carry them, and he was a trusted bullpen arm. And he played a huge role in all those close games that they won at the end, all those comeback wins that Georgia was able to get. A lot of times he was on the mound or had got them to that point. So for me, Brian Zeldin is the unsung hero for this year's Georgia team.
And there was a period of time when maybe outside of Charlie Condon, he was their most important guy for a while, because that was in the period of time early in the season where they were really spinning their wheels, and he was, for a while, kind of the only guy they seemed to really trust out of the bullpen. And other guys came around, but yeah, there was a long stretch where he was the guy out there. And you're right that the numbers would have been a whole lot better if it weren't for the fact that by the end of the year, I have to assume he was pretty fatigued, because of how much he'd thrown. All right, let's talk Vanderbilt, Mark. I will toss this one over to you. What do you got on Vanderbilt's overlooked storyline?
So Vanderbilt, for me, it's, they stole 102 bases in 117 attempts, which is really awesome. And the problem I got with that is that's not the way we play the game these days. I mean, it's you look at who won the games and who advanced in the postseason. It's about slugging. It's about hitting the ball out of the park. In the SEC, Vanderbilt was 13th out of 14 teams in home runs, 12th in on-base percentage, 10th in slugging. And we talked about, if you're 10th in slugging and you're next to last in home runs, there's a lot of doubles in there. So I do think that that's what Vanderbilt's got to establish. One, don't listen to me, but can you win this way? Can you win without being as offensive as a Tennessee or an LSU last year, or Florida tends to be every year? I know ballpark factor's different, and Vanderbilt has, they tend to craft their roster in different ways, but I think they need more variety in their lineup, and they need some bigger, stronger, physical players. And maybe you give up some of that speed that we talked about earlier, or you give up some other things defensively, perhaps. But I mean, that's the way the game has flipped. Certainly at the top end of the sport, and that's where Vanderbilt likes to play. Right? They certainly earned the right to be up there. So I do think that there's, and maybe we saw that with some staff changes, on the coaching staff this year, and maybe that'll be one of the interesting storylines to see what that lineup looks like in 2025.
Yeah, and part of why they were able to play as well as they did during stretches. Now, it wasn't your typical Vanderbilt season, but when they played well, it was because their pitching staff was really talented. And so my overlooked storyline is that we went into the year talking a lot about the importance of Carter Holton being healthy and Bryce Cunningham and Grayson Carter taking steps forward. And to some degree, those things happened. I think mostly Bryce Cunningham becoming a consistent starter of those options. Because by the end of the year, obviously Carter Holton wasn't himself. Mm-hmm. But for me, the more important piece of that was that the freshman arms were really good. And not even necessarily Ethan McIlvain. Like if you'd have told me, at the beginning of the year, the Vanderbilt freshmen are going to be a big piece of the puzzle on the mound, and go, okay, well, Ethan McIlvain is number one there. And like, he had some nice moments, but he had injuries himself. But I'm talking more Miller Green, Alex Kranzler, Brennan Cyber, Luke Guth. Those guys really kind of made Vanderbilt's season in my mind, because I think there's a different scenario where those guys aren't as effective as they were for most of the season, and Vanderbilt ends up being a team that just isn't a postseason team at all because of it, right? Because the margin was fairly narrow for them ultimately. So to me, that was just so huge that they were able to lean on those guys, and it bodes well for a team that is still going to have a lot of pitching talent, but those guys are going to be a year more mature.
Yeah, and they're going to need big impact from those guys, because the pitchers who threw most of the innings this year, they all heard their names this week. Everybody but Thompson, right? He's really the outlier. But I mean, with Holton, with Cunningham, with Grayson Carter, I mean, Futrell, all those guys are most. They got drafted this week in the top 10 rounds. So you have to expect that there's going to be plenty of innings to compete for. And those freshman arms and newcomers, for that matter, are going to come in with an opportunity. And so it's going to be a really interesting Vanderbilt team to watch, with the staff changes, with some of the personnel changes, new ballpark renovation, all of these things. It's going to be an exciting time, and because of how much change there's going to be in Nashville.
It's just going to be an interesting. We'll have plenty of time to talk about this as the fall gets underway and what have you. But I think it's going to be, for a number of reasons, there might not be a more interesting program to watch from a 30,000 foot view than Vanderbilt next year, because you've got some cool stuff like the stadium renovations. That'll be great. You've got some players to get excited about, particularly on the mound, but also you made some staff changes. There's going to be, I think, a little more scrutiny on your offense. I mean, there already was, but there's going to be, I think, even more because you made the staff changes, and because it's so clear that part of the game is what's been holding them back, right? So they're going to be fascinating to watch. So we'll that's obviously something we'll dive into quite a bit this fall, I am sure. Okay, moving on to South Carolina. That's one I'm hitting lead off on. Another kind of weird season. The last couple of seasons of the Mark Kingston era at South Carolina, really kind of strange in that they both kind of followed. The highs were higher in 2023 than they were in 2024, right? Because the 2023 team at one point was top 5 in the country before things kind of tapered off. But kind of the same deal last year with South Carolina. They had some high highs. They had some moments where you're like, is this team even going to make regionals? And then ultimately kind of ends up somewhere in between, being a host team and a team that misses regionals. My overlooked thing here, and I think this is a good lesson, not that these coaches need advice from me, but to me, it seems like a good lesson to internalize, is that you look at what Austin Brindling brought to the table late in the year, and his story was covered pretty well, because he went from literally zero playing time to being the leadoff man, right? So that, I feel like we, generally did a pretty good job of talking about, but also Dalton Reeves. I mean, a guy who really started hitting the ball really well late in the year and giving them another power bat in their lineup. Those two guys seem to kind of reignite something for South Carolina. I think about the series win against Kentucky. Now, Blake Jackson had a big part of that too, but both of those guys were right in the middle of that whole deal in that series against Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And the bigger lesson I'm talking about here is just that, like, it's tempting, unless you're dealing with injuries, it's tempting to really narrow your roster as the season goes on. But like, there's value in, hey, if a guy's practicing good, if like he's got a good attitude, if he's doing things right, like, circle back on somebody, because you really just never know. And I think that Austin Brindling in particular was a lesson in that, of like, you brought this guy in for a reason. And maybe it wasn't happening for him early, but that doesn't mean it won't happen for him late. And I thought that was just such a huge part of South Carolina, even being as good as they ended up being.
Yeah, I love those kind of stories where, a guy bides his time and finally gets the opportunity and then seizes it. I think for me, the storyline is, last year was the first year that South Carolina has been to consecutive regionals since 13 and 14. And before that, they had gone to 15 straight that ended in 14. Okay. So it just goes to show you they were the model of consistency, and then the model of inconsistency, because they are good. It's just up and down, right? They go in 16, 18, 21, 23, 24, but there's some years in there where they didn't go, and they weren't going in consecutive years. And it is kind of, I don't know, kind of ironic that the year they kind of break that streak and they go back-to-back years, there's a coaching change, and Kingston is out, and Paul comes in. So that'll be what, and Paul Manheri is a really consistent influence, right? And we'll have to see if that translates onto the field for them going forward, because with South Carolina is going to be one of those teams that we go into the year. Well, we're going to go into the fall not knowing a whole lot about them. We know a lot about Petrie, and then what else, or where the strength's going to be. And I think that's going to be one of the fascinating stories of this year. And because of so much uncertainty, it's hard to have that continuity and have that consistency, which is what South Carolina's craving right now. They're just tired of this. You don't have to go to Omaha every year. No one does, but you at least need to be in that discussion, and your dips not fall as far as they have in recent times.
Paul Canary, by the way, would be.
I know, that would have been funny. I should have finished it. Yeah.
If we were doing like an animated TV show and turned all the SEC coaches into animals, that would be Paul Canary.
Yeah.
Let's keep.
Wonder what he thinks about that.
Let's file that idea away for a rainy day. Okay, let's talk Florida. What a season that was. Yeah, believe it or not, Florida, technically speaking, at least according to our friends at Warren Nolan, where I got these standings, finished only above Missouri in the East, and yet finished the season in Omaha. So how about that?
Mm-hmm. In the semis.
So yeah, exactly. Yeah. So tell us about Florida, Mark. What do you think was overlooked about them this year?
I really like when a player enters a program. Maybe he's heralded, maybe he's not as heralded as some of his teammates, but still comes in with some press, has a first year, and it doesn't really go great. And instead of leaving, he sticks around, and then he comes back for that second year, and then it doesn't go the way he wants either. And most of the people in this era are going to leave at that point. And I don't blame you. Sometimes you just need a change of scenery. However, if you do stick around for that third year and it pays off, it is a lesson that all of us old people love to see, right? You paid your dues, you got better, you put in the work. And I'm talking about Fisher Jameson here. So this is a kid. He threw, he didn't throw very much, right? His first 2 years. And when he did, he didn't have a lot of success. And then he ends up this year. Where's my stats here? Ends up this year with a ERA under 4. He went 5-0. He threw 67 over 67 innings. With 60 hits, 79 strikeouts. But I think the other part that really stands out to me is late in the year when they needed him, in postseason, he ended up throwing 3 1/3 against Oklahoma State in a regional. 4 innings against Clemson in a super, 3 against A&M, and 4 2/3 against A&M in Omaha. I mean, this was someone who was, quote, a bit player from even earlier this year, and ends up pitching in the high leverage innings throughout the biggest games of the Florida season. So I just love those kinds of stories. I know they seem to be. We used to get them quite frequently, and now they're a little bit more uncommon. So when they occur, I like to point them out.
Yeah, it's a great call. He ends up, he's gonna end up having, and maybe he would have anyway, but certainly helped himself with regards to having a pro career. Got drafted this week, and
Yeah. 9th round.
So a good story all around. Mine is kind of similar in that last year Ty Evans was a guy like that. I say last year 2023 season. By the time we got to Omaha, he was kind of looked like a budding superstar, and until he got injured late in the year, which was a bummer. Until he got injured late in the year, he had really backed up that performance. He was having a really nice year, and he's not a perfect player. There was still a little more swing and miss than you'd like, et cetera, et cetera. But like he was hitting for average, he was hitting for power. He looked like a guy. He was kind of quietly a little bit of a heartbeat in the middle of that order. The good news, though, Mark, is that he's coming back, so we'll get another year. He'll get another healthy year, and like he's toolsy enough to where he could be a guy that comes back and still ends up right, giving himself some really good opportunities in pro baseball. So it was good to see him back up that performance, even if it did end prematurely because of, I believe, it was a wrist injury. Is that right, Mark? Something like that, a wrist injury.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Chasing a foul ball.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, there was that. Ty Evans. All right, Mark. Missouri's our last team on the board. This is my turn, right? Yes.
Yep.
So for me, I'm going to go with Jackson Lovich, kind of becoming a guy that, look, the offense at Mizzou last year was not good. I think Carrick Jackson would tell you that. and I don't just mean me and Mark. I think he would tell you, listener, who walked up to him on the street. Like he was pretty open about we got to get better offensively. Jackson Lovich was the one guy last year who, would likely be coming back, or at least had the eligibility to come back, who you looked at and said, that's a foundational guy. Now, there was a little bit of worry because his brother Ross is at Arkansas. His other brother Ian was a commit to Arkansas. And so there's a little bit of worry that maybe Jackson might jump in the portal and try to get to Arkansas. So all 3 Lovich brothers would be on the roster at the same time, which, selfishly, that'd have been pretty cool. But from a Mizzou standpoint, they held on to him. And so, he's going to come back next year, and a little bit like Trevor Austin coming into the 2024 season, like Lovich is now going to be a guy they look at and this is kind of your lineup. It starts with you. And they're going to have to build around him. So him becoming that kind of cornerstone, I think, was something kind of overlooked, especially when you consider there was a lot of worry that it might not matter and that he might not be there in Columbia in 2025 anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good call. That's kind of part of what I was going to talk about too. It's just, that offense was so bad. I mean, they were the bottom of just about every offensive statistic that matters. They didn't hit for power. They didn't hit for average. They were going to steal bases, but really they didn't get on base enough for that to matter. So, so that made what the pitchers had to do that much more challenging. So, You just look at that pitching staff, how they were able to keep themselves in games and even win series. I mean, they lost some close games that could have gone either way had they had just a little bit more offense. So if you're looking for a silver lining to this, the offense cannot get much worse. Okay, it should improve, and they were still in games, and they were still, fighting to the end, and I think that's what, if you're Carrick, that's what you're looking for, right? I know I don't have this as good a roster as some of these other teams, but I'm still competitive and I'm still fighting and I'm still there. And it just goes to show you, I mean, with the pitching staff, they really rode 6 or 7 guys and just, and mixed and matched and did, piggybacks and all of those different things to stay in games. And as you continue to build your program, you hope that model continues to work with better players, but also you don't have to be so good because your offense is going to give you more margin for error. So I think that's, when you look at Missouri, we wondered for a while there if they were going to be one of these, 4-26 kind of teams, and they weren't. They were much better than that, and I think it gives you hope as you go forward. Competing, as the league is only getting more difficult as Texas and Oklahoma are coming in, where's this going? Where's this program? Can they compete? And the question is, well, maybe they can't compete at the top, but they're going to have years where they're going to be able to compete for regional berths and to have some games that matter down the stretch. And I think at this point, that's what you're looking for. If you're in Mizzou, you don't want to be the basement every year. You want to be in contention. And then maybe if things align and you get a superstar, then you've got hope and you've got foundation. You can bring him. You have the proof of concept to bring him in and him stay, and then he can elevate you. And you have that magical season.
Yeah, a couple things there. I think it was a really positive sign for the health of the program that they really played out the string pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
That they're really, and I think part of that, honestly, like I don't, this could be incorrect, but I have a hunch maybe that Florida sweep came at exactly the right time for them to, because if they lose that series, or maybe they get swept in it, which is I think what a lot of people expected in that series, even being in Columbia, like then maybe it starts to get a little bit harder, and okay, it's really a slog now. But that Florida series came kind of in early April. It's right smack dab in the middle of the season. And maybe that kind of juiced them enough to like, okay, look, we're undermanned here. We're not going to beat around the bush about it, but like we can play with anybody. And so I do think that was a valuable result for them to kind of push them through the rest of the season. Ultimately, it's no moral victories in the SEC, but I do think the way that team played, and to your point, the fact that like they were not, historically bad in terms of their record, which, we, as you mentioned, we thought might be on the table. Positives there if you're a Mizzou fan, kind of looking for some silver linings there. I was also going to shout out Brock Lucas, who was a very effective reliever for them. I don't think he was maybe the guy that certainly wasn't the guy I expected to be arguably their most effective reliever, at least until Ryan McNeish kind of came along and became what he became late in the year. He was just kind of Brock Lucas, just a steady guy all year long, and really kind of held them up. So shout out to him as well. All right, Mark, that's going to do it for an episode. That is an SEC East Overlooked Storylines episode. Kind of fun to go back through this stuff and give kind of one last look at what was before we start to maybe look ahead a little more with the fall approaching here in a little bit. So the fall is coming, by the way, this week as we're recording this. SEC football media days going on. So like you do know that it is right around the corner. So but it has been good to kind of look back one more time before we look forward and give some flowers, if you will, as the kids would say, for some performances that got overlooked.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to mention is, Joe was just at the Cape. He had a couple of stories, one on hitters, one on pitchers, with an SEC slant of what's going on up there. But make sure you check those out as as summer winds down and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, we lost this guy. Who's our next? Who's our holdover, or who's our new guy, or who's the guy who really didn't play a whole lot, but who's going to get a lot better this year? As we try to figure out what these rosters are going to look like next year.
Yeah, we've got a lot of that. That's a good thought, Mark, to mention some of that stuff. Yes, I did a standout 15 hitters, 15 pitchers from the SEC who are having standout seasons on the Cape so far this season. David Seifert, our prospect writer, is going to have a post late this week, early next, that ranks the Team USA, or at least does evaluations of the Team USA players. Obviously, a lot of SEC guys on those lists. So be sure to check that out. Mark and I are going to have season in review stuff that Mark alluded to. It's going to have kind of 1 foot looking back and 1 foot stepping forward to kind of project what teams may look like come the 2025 season. We're also going to do some different things with podcasts this offseason, looking to have more guests than we've had in the past. So we will have that as well. Is there anything I'm forgetting, Mark, that we know? We're not exactly sure what form this is going to take, but we do have 2 new members of the conference. Mark and I are going to brainstorm some ideas for, like, we want to do some specific Oklahoma and Texas stuff to kind of introduce, not just for their own fans, obviously, but for fans of other teams, to kind of introduce those teams. If you kind of weren't paying attention to them, introduce those teams to you, so what they're going to bring to the conference. So we're looking to do some Oklahoma, Texas centric content, especially once the fall gets underway, to kind of introduce them to the league, if you will.
Yeah, we'll have to learn which direction do we do this. I'm confused.
Be careful, Mark. You're going to get.
I'll get a penalty when I.
Yeah, you'll get arrested. They're going to come arrest you for that.
Yeah. I got to learn. I'm new.
My favorite in the horns down discourse was a Texas beat writer I followed, because a bunch of stories got written on the first day of SEC Media Days about whether or not horns down will be a penalty. And I think he summed it up well. And even from a Texas perspective, he summed it up well by quote tweeting one of the stories and said, "We don't have to keep doing this." Mm-hmm. and I couldn't agree more. Like, we don't have to do this. I was about to get into it, but never mind.
I mean, if that's the worst you hear, you're really good shit, because I think we've all heard much worse at a football game.
Yeah, like, that's the thing, is like, you're going to penalize, but like, why don't you get in the middle of a fumble scrum and like see hear what's said there and what's done there? Like, it'd be a whole different deal. Anyway, regardless, before we get too fired up here, Mark, we will leave it there. We'll be back next week with the SEC West overlooked storylines. Looking forward to talking about those as well. Until then, plenty of stuff on the website. The content at D1 Baseball doesn't stop. Plenty of summer ball stuff, plenty of features still out there. All kinds of stuff coming at you. So we have not slowed the pace all that much when compared to the postseason. So we appreciate you hanging on through the off season and sticking with us. We certainly plan on making it worth your while. Thank you to Pitch Logic for sponsoring this and every episode of the Highway to Hoover podcast. I'm just now remembering I forgot their ad read at the top, but that's okay. Thank you to Pitch Logic, as always, for sponsoring. Thank you to Mark, as always, for joining me. And thank you, the listener, for listening. We'll talk to y'all soon.